the NIHR-funded, NIHR-supported incubator for clinical AI and digital healthcare. My name is Jeff Hogg. I'm a clinician scientist at University Hospitals Birmingham NHS Foundation Trust. And the aim of this incubator is to build a multidisciplinary community of researchers and practitioners focused on clinical AI. And to identify some of the kind of more interesting and challenging issues around clinical AI and invite topic experts, as we have today, to explore that with us, and also hear from other members of our community on their perspectives on the issue. So with that in mind, we've got a solid 20 to 30 minute slot put aside for Q&A. Please do type away your ideas as we go along. We've got two kind of separate streams there. One is the chat function at the bottom. So if you can add any sort of ideas and thoughts you want to share there as we go along, but also the Q&A one. So if you could put there any questions rather than comments that you'd like us to put to our speaker at the end, that would be fantastic. To keep the flow of things, we're going to dig into all of that at the end. And I'll be picking out questions there for us to explore. But please don't be disheartened if we don't manage to get to them all. We've got a whole kind of track of webinars and events to plan moving forward. So it's all really helpful information for us to think about the kind of things we should be talking about moving forward. With that in mind as well, at the end, I'll just point you to some of the ways you can suggest topics for us to visit down the track as part of the webinar series and other events. So keep your eyes peeled for that too. The other thing I should mention, you have probably had permission pop up and the normal robot voice of recording started. But the plan is for this to be recorded and available publicly on the website that you will have gone through for registration. But we'll have some more links about that at the end. So today we'll be focusing on large language models, which won't be new for many of you, but a type of artificial intelligence that have taken very large volumes of text, and they've learned to make new text by predicting sequences of words. And they've made a big splash in the media generally, and also in other sectors outside healthcare, seemingly improving productivity of companies or individuals doing work. And there's much noise and thought about the kind of role that they should have within healthcare, but as within many other innovations, there are some particular barriers to entry into the world of healthcare, a big one of which is, of course, regulation. So that's what we're going to be digging into today. And we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Hugh Harvey, who is an ex-consultant radiologist from the NHS, also helped Babylon Health achieve a world-first regulatory approval for an AI-enabled chatbot. And since 2018, they're managing director of Hardian Health, which offers multifaceted consultancy services for software as a medical device. So without further ado from me, I'd like to hand over to Hugh to kick us off. And thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks, Jeff, for the intro, and hello, everybody. Good to see some names I recognise in the attendees. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the regulation of large language models, known as LLMs. And I'll be focusing mainly on the European regulations because we're based physically in Europe. I will touch on FDA as well. But I'm going to start off just by sort of separating LLMs and their specific type of functionality away from what we currently have. So currently we have deterministic single point solution algorithms like this, which can determine findings on a chest x-ray. And what the regulators really want to know when they risk classify and audit these devices, they want to know three questions. Is it AI? Yes. Is it a medical device? Well, this is a medical device because, as we'll come to, it meets the intended use of a medical purpose. Is it safe? That's what they want to know. Does this work as it says in the claims, and is it safe to use? So exactly the same questions apply to large language models. There's an unbelievable amount of excitement and hype around large language models in medicine, but I'm not really seeing anyone talk about the regulation of them. And they should be asking these three same questions. So here we go. Here's Rad AI, who are a company who said they're going to be doing X-ray report summarization. So the radiologist can summarize, radiologist dictates their findings, and then the AI can use generative AI and LLMs to summarize the findings and then make some recommendations. Is this AI? Yes, it is. Is it a medical device? Well, some would say yes, and some would say no. In fact, we don't know yet because the regulations do not specifically include this use case. So it remains to be seen what the regulators say. My hunch is yes, but I'm very happy to be proven wrong by regulatory auditory authorities. Is it safe? Well, again, we don't know the answer to that either yet. We need to see evidence. As always, you can't get regulatory approval without evidence. Well, what about LLMs doing other things than radiology summarization? What about taking clinical texts and clinical language models and feeding that output into other AI models and making predictions? Or looking at the electronic medical records and representing patients digitally via tokenization and then passing that on to models. It all gets very complex, but fundamental three questions remain the same. Is it AI? Yes. Is it a medical device? Well, probably, if you're going to be doing prediction tasks or passing it on to a downstream machine learning model. Is it safe? Again, we don't know. No one's done it yet. No one's proven it's safe yet. So we're in a gray area at the cutting edge. Currently, 0 large language models are regulatory approved for medical use, to my knowledge. Please correct me wrong if I'm wrong in the chat, if someone's got regulatory approval since I wrote this talk last week, but I've not heard of any. And therefore, anyone using this, the early adopters, are using them at their own risk and, more importantly, at the risk of their patients, which is, after all, why we do medical device regulation, is to ensure the safety of patients. So what might make a large language model classify as a medical device? So it depends on the intended use of the large language model. Is it for a medical purpose? If so, it's a medical device, and it requires regulatory approval as a medical device product by law in pretty much every country in the world. What is the meaning of medical purpose or medical use? Here's a short list: diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction, prognosis, treatment, or alleviation of a disease or disability/injury, i.e., if you are informing or driving patient management in pretty much any way, you are likely to be a medical device. But of course, not all intended users, they mean that you're a medical device. But that doesn't mean there's no regulation whatsoever. There are still standards around health software, so billing and scheduling health software, or I don't know, patient-facing portals, that counts as health software. There are cybersecurity regulations. There's GDPR in Europe and HIPAA as well for patient data confidentiality. There's the EU AI Act, which is now in law and coming into force over the next few years. And this won't be the end of legislation and regulation around AI. There'll be more coming, you mark my words. So whether or not you are a medical device is irrelevant. There is still regulation. It depends which regulation on whether or not you are a medical device or not. So how do you determine what the intended use of a large language model is? Well, ideally, the manufacturer will have written down an intended use statement. It's a short statement, can be a few sentences long, and it's a required item in Annex 2 of the medical device regulations in Europe. And you have to include all of these points. What does the device do? What's its intended purpose? Who are the intended users? The patient population, the medical conditions, the principles of operation of the device, the rationale for the qualification of the product as a device. So why have you decided it's a medical device or not? And then therefore the risk class of the device and the justification for being in that risk class. Again, I don't know if any LLM manufacturers have done this exercise, but they should be thinking about it. Additionally, the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, has added additional considerations for software as a medical device, which obviously includes AI system, which obviously includes large language models. Software can also do other things, which means it's a medical device, providing means and suggestions for mitigating a disease. So if you have a large language model which might chat with a patient and say, maybe you should do X, Y, or Z in order to reduce your risk of a disease, it's a medical device. If an LLM is providing information for determining compatibility, or detecting, diagnosing, monitoring, or treating physical conditions, states of health, illness, or congenital deformities, it's a medical device. And lastly, if it's an aid to diagnosis, screening, monitoring, determination, blah, 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 of a physiological status. It's a medical device. So these are very, very broad catch-all terms within the regulation. And it's almost impossible to try and conceive of an LLM that really is trying to avoid all of this medical device stuff. So are you a medical device or not? Here are sort of 9 very commonly discussed potential use cases for large language models. And these are not official determinations. I would urge you, if you're making any one of these 9, to write an intended use statement out and try and qualify whether your device is a medical device or not. And there is a gray zone in between. The gray zone is always there because regulations cannot predict what is going to be invented. You know, when the medical device regulations were written up in 2017, medical transcription, automated patient communication weren't on the regulators' minds, but they now exist. So let's just go through these. On the column on the left, non-medical device. So this might be something in research. You're not a medical device if you're only doing research because you're not impacting a patient's pathway or care. Medical coding and billing, again, not a medical device. Training and education. So you're just training doctors and providing education to them, not a medical device. Then you've got the right-hand column. Obviously, clinical decision support can be a medical device, but not all clinical decision support, and we'll get onto the nuances of that later. Predicting health outcomes, that's definitely a medical device because prediction is literally one of the words in the definition of a medical device. And personalized treatment plans, because you are suggesting ways of mitigating a disease. So it's definitely a medical device. The gray zone is a little bit of an unknown, and this is where the risk is. Medical transcription, this is probably the #1 use case for large language models at the moment being touted, whether it's ambient clinical scribes or, as I showed earlier, summarization of radiology reports or summarization of anything is a medical transcription service. Whether or not that is a class as a medical device, we are yet to see whether a regulatory authority has said yes or no to this. My guess is it's going to tend towards yes, it is a medical device for the simple reason that clinical notes are a very powerful tool that essentially doctors rely on to make decisions about patients. And if you cannot rely on those words in the clinical notes accurately, or you can't rely on them 100%, patients could come to harm. So I think it just tips over the edge of being a medical device. Electronic health records enhancement. This is quite a broad area, and I see someone in chat has asked, what does it mean? It can mean any number of things. So analyzing or ingesting the entire electronic health records to pull out instances of information. You might want to know, how many smokers have given up smoking in the past 5 years, and you could pull that out. That itself might not be a medical device, but then if you are then creating appointments for all of those people to help them stop smoking, you are then aiding in decision, changing someone's care pathway, making them have an appointment in order to mitigate the risk of an ultimate disease. And then the last one is automated patient communication. May or may not be a medical device, depending on what you are telling the patient. If you're telling them a drug dose or telling them a treatment plan, you're probably a medical device. If you're telling them when their appointment is, you might not be. So it's a gray area, and it will come down to your exact intended use. So I can't really be more clear than that. Some of them are medical devices, some of them are not, and there's this gray zone. What can we do about it? Well, depends where you are in the world. Here are the main jurisdictions, and this is what you would need to look at, the legislation of each and every one. Obviously, in Europe, we've got the medical device regulation, and now, highlighted in bold, the AI Act of the European Union. The UK does not have an AI Act, nor does America, though they are thinking of doing one, I hear. So you will need to understand these regulatory frameworks if you think you're in the grey zone or in the medical device zone. What risk class would you be? So this is the IMDRF recommended risk classification, and it's split in sort of 2 axes. One is the significance of the information provided by the large language model to the healthcare situation, and the other is the state of the healthcare situation or the patient condition. So obviously the higher risk stuff is higher risk class. So if the significance of information is super important, like it's treating or diagnosing a patient, it goes into the left-hand column. And if the patient is in a critical condition or in a serious state of healthcare need, then they're in the top row. And as you can see, there is no class 1 in this. Don't think you can get away with class 1 for this. You cannot. By definition, and we'll get onto this, AI as a medical device is a high-risk product under the European AI Act. And it is almost inconceivable that you can both be a high-risk device under the AI Act and a low-risk device under the medical device regulations. I'm sure people will try and argue it, but I really don't think it's possible. So I would say for 99.9% of large language model use cases as a medical device, they're going to be class 2A and above. What does that mean in practical terms? It means you need a quality management system. You need to have a notified body. You need to have audits, and you need to conduct post-market surveillance. All of those things will apply to all medical device large language models. Here are the categories of the AI Act. The pertinent one is the high-risk one, which obviously includes medical devices, anything involved in clinical decision support or diagnosis. And that's got much more stringent requirements than the others. Please don't go into the unacceptable category and build large language models that are trying to do things that are going to be illegal in Europe. There's no point putting money and time into those. And then there are some minimal risk ones. But as I've said, if it's a medical device and it's AI, it cannot be minimal risk. It is by definition high risk. So what regulatory mechanisms are there in the AI Act that you have to understand? And we're going to look at MDR after this. So in the AI Act, regardless of whether you're a medical device or not, you need to undergo a conformity assessment. That means you need to get a CE mark. If you're a medical device, this will be audited at the same time as your medical device audit. But if you're not a medical device, you will still need a CE mark. So you still need to get regulated. The Act does allow for predefined changes. So this means that AI can be iterated upon without requiring a new CE marking audit each and every time. That's for non-medical devices. There is no current legislation for change control in medical devices, though that is apparently in the pipeline, but it's not here yet. So non-medical devices can iterate, medical devices can't iterate. You have to be very transparent. Now, this is a problem for large language models, and I'll talk about the problem specifically later, in that you must ensure transparency about your system. And one of the things in the AI Act, it explicitly says, you need to tell your potential customers and users what the training data was. So if you are using a third-party large language model, like OpenAI or Mistral or Perplexity, you won't be able to do that. So you will not be able to comply with the EU AI Act, and therefore you will not receive your CE mark. And the last one is post-market surveillance. You can't just dump these things on market and hope everything works out okay. You have to, by law, monitor the large language model in perpetuity forever for the entire life cycle that device is available on market. You have to acknowledge and react to every single time someone raises a concern, issue, complaint, bug, or error. So it's not like as scalable as some people might think. You're going to have a team of people working purely on the post-market surveillance. So, as we've said, medical device LLMs, if they are intended for a medical purpose, they will come under both the medical device regulations and the AI Act. So this is going to cause some regulatory problems for large language models. The first one is, as I've alluded to, you can't use open source models because two reasons. One, the AI Act, you have to be able to be transparent about how your model was trained, which you won't be able to because OpenAI is not going to tell you. And they have no quality documentation. And this is known as software of unknown provenance. You have a piece of software, an open source large language model, that you don't know anything about its documentation, and you won't receive any from these big open source companies. And therefore, you cannot include that into your medical device, into your quality management system, because there's just no way of checking their quality. So you can't use open source models. You have to use a closed source model, ideally one that you develop yourself or someone else has developed and can provide that level of quality documentation. Then when it actually comes to the CE marking process, you're going to have to explain to the auditor how you're dealing with infinite inputs and outputs. How on earth do you quality assure an infinite complex system? I don't know the answer to that, but someone's going to have to try and tackle that problem. Then you're going to have to reassure the auditors that you have mitigated as best as is practical against all known and unknown cybersecurity risks. That includes people trying to prompt inject or prompt hack or do anything to your large language model. You're going to have to stop users from doing that in any way conceivable. You can't use a large language model that's been trained on copyrighted material. That's not acceptable, especially in the medical device realm. Most large language models are not GDPR compliant. They store an incredible amount of data, and including data about individual people. If you're ingesting EHR data, it's not GDPR compliant. If your model is bigger than 10 to the power of 25 flops, that's illegal under the EU AI Act, because apparently that poses systemic risks, but I'm not quite clear what that means, but don't do it. Conducting clinical studies is going to be very hard because these devices are not deterministic. What that means is two people ask the same question or give the same input to a device, and the LLM can produce different outputs every single time. And in fact, that's what they're designed to do. Plus, they hallucinate on top of that. And as far as I'm aware, no one has reduced the hallucination rate to 0. That's going to be challenging in clinical studies. The others are practical problems. As far as I know, no notified body has ever audited this technology. So it's going to take a while for people to figure out how they're going to audit it. And if you're going to do it in America, you can't do a 510K, which is a streamlined predicate-based submission where you say, I'm equivalent to something on market. This is a new technology, which in the FDA language raises new concerns about technological safety and efficacy. So you'll have to do a de novo application, which can take up to a year. And if you are second in the queue for a de novo, you have to wait until the first person has finished and then do a 510K. So there'll be a race, I bet, to get the first de novo application in for a large language model for certain use cases. And that's just to start. The EU AI Act, if you read through it, actually makes it quite difficult for large language models in medicine. As I've mentioned, recital 60, you have to be able to tell everybody in sufficient detail what content is used for training your model. And the reason for that is you have to allow third-party copyright holders to exercise their rights, because if you've used copyrighted material, they have a right to know and sue you if they want to. Article 9.5, it says testing should ensure that high-risk AI systems perform consistently for their intended purpose. And as we've said, LLMs do not perform consistently. They give a different answer given the same input almost every time. The last one, high-risk AI systems should be as resilient as possible regarding errors, faults, or inconsistencies. Again, very difficult with large language models. I'm not saying this is impossible. I am just trying to warn everybody that it's going to be very difficult. Then we come on to the third problem, or fourth problem on that list, which is exponential hallucination problem. And I spent a lot of time on this slide because it's quite a complex thing. But let's imagine we have a clinical note-taking large language model. It's listening to a consultation between a GP and the patient, and it summarizes. It transcribes the whole thing, and then it provides a summary. And let's assume that it has an error rate of less than 1 error per consultation. So out of every consultation, sometimes you get an error, 1 error, sometimes you won't. So in 1 consultation, you might have 1 small error. In 5 consultations, there might be 3 errors. Let's say that patient goes back and forth from the GP, goes to see a specialist, goes to see an occupational therapist, and they're all using large language models to transcribe their notes. What do we end up with? A whole bunch of errors scattered across these summarizations of notes. Now, of course, this happens with humans. Humans make little errors here and there. But what humans can't do is read all of those notes and create a summary instantly. LLMs can, and they will be used to do this. And they're going to ingest all of those errors and make their own errors. And of course, after a patient has been in the healthcare system for a while, they're going to have lots of these summaries based on all these consultations. And then someone else might come along and say, well, let's summarize all of that. And you're just going to end up with a complete gobbledygook of an electronic health record, and you're not going to know what's the truth and what's not. And that's going to go on forever, which is why I call it the exponential hallucination problem. I don't know how to solve this problem, and it makes me feel rather uncomfortable that we're almost about to let this happen. So if you are developing a medical LLM as a medical device, this is what you would have to do to get a CE mark under both the medical device regulations and the EU AI Act. You would have to solve the software of unknown provenance problem, i.e. find a large language model either with quality documentation that is good enough for a CE submission, or create your own large language model and do the quality documentation yourself. You have to make available your training data sources, not the data itself, but you have to have a comprehensive list of all the data that you've used. And if that includes patient confidential details, that has to be disclosed. You will have to report everything to the consumers and in terms of your performance, whether good or bad, including all errors and bugs and things like that. You have to be transparent to your users. You have to employ data protection and governance procedures, i.e. GDPR, HIPAA, and all of that. You have to keep a technical file or medical device file as it's known. You will have to keep stringent records, or not only on your development, but also on your post-market surveillance. You will have to conduct ongoing risk management. You will have to ensure that there's human oversight. You will have to keep measuring your robustness, your security, and accuracy, and more. So it is not as simple as a two-man team getting an open source version of OpenAI and putting some weird prompt around it saying, pretend you're a doctor, and then selling it to a hospital. That's not going to fly. There's a lot of work to do and technical documentation in the background. And here are some specifics from the EU AI Act and when to do them. And as you can see at the bottom, risk management and quality management go from start to finish. I'm not going to read the slide out, but you can see that even during data acquisition, training, all the way to modeling and deployment, there are things that you'll have to do, you'll have to document, put them in your quality management system, and continually test. Okay, what if you don't do this stuff? Well, under the EU AI Act, you can be fined up to 35 million euros. Ouch. Even in the bottom row here, even if you missell or mislabel your large language model, so let's say you build a large language model that is a medical device, but you start selling it going, it's not a medical device, don't worry, you could be fined 7.5 million euros under the EU AI Act. So it's up to you whether you want to take that business risk or not. Personally, I don't think I would. There are standards and more will come. These are the published standards available at the moment. They're all pretty good, but again, there's more coming. 13485 is the one I want to focus on. It's about quality management. This is needed for all medical devices. And that's going to be updated soon as well to have some more inclusions for software as a medical device. The other interesting one is the AI risk management 23894. There's a lot of risks, as I've explained, with large language models, and this standard actually does cover a surprising amount of them already. So that's a good read as well. Just a note, you have to buy these standards if you're going to be audited. I have seen people fail audit because they've referenced standards that they don't own a copy of. And the auditor has said, well, where's your copy? How can you comply with the standard you have not read? So you do need to purchase these. They're not expensive, 200 euros or so, which is better than paying a 7.5 million euro fine. So what about non-medical device LLMs? Well, as I said at the beginning, if they're not intended for a medical purpose, they still come under health software and under the EU AI Act because they're still AI and they're still counted as high risk. So there are still some of the same regulatory problems. You can't use open source models. They still have infinite inputs and outputs. They still have unknown cybersecurity risk, etc., etc. So while you might not have to go and get a CE mark under the medical device regulations, you may well have to get one under the EU AI Act, and you still have to solve all of these problems. So don't think that you are getting away with it just because you're not a medical device. So what about in America? We talked about Europe. What about in America? I've been on 2 calls with the FDA to discuss large language models that summarize clinical notes in some form. And we went to the FDA with the argument that these are called non-clinical decision support devices. And the FDA has very clear non-CDS guidance. And they have 4 criteria which must be met in order for you to say, I am not a medical device, therefore I'm non-CDS and I do not need FDA regulation. And these are the 4 criteria that you have to abide by. Your device does not acquire, process, or analyze medical images, signals, or patterns. Well, unfortunately, the FDA considers large language models indeed to be processing or analyzing medical signals or patterns because they're analyzing medical text, which is data about a patient. So it fails the first criteria. The second criteria is that your device should display, analyze, or print medical information normally communicated between healthcare professionals and their patients. The FDA does say that large language models tick this box. So they pass number 2. They fail number 1, but they pass number 2. The third one is that non-CDS should provide recommendations to a healthcare professional rather than a specific output or directive. Now, depending on the LLM output, the FDA could deem either way. The ones that we went to the FDA with gave specific outputs. They just gave one summary. And the FDA said, well, that only gives one specific output, not options. So you failed that criteria. And the last one is that the software should provide the basis of the recommendations so that the healthcare professional does not rely primarily on the recommendation to make a decision. And the FDA considers that summarization large language models don't offer the healthcare professional the basis of their recommendations. E.g., if you ask an LLM to summarize clinical notes and make a referral letter, in that referral letter, it does not give you all the information that it used to make that referral letter. Now, that might seem counterintuitive, but that's what the FDA have ruled. So LLMs in summarization of clinical notes, in at least 2 practical cases that I've been involved with, have failed large language models on 3 out of the 4 counts for non-CDS. So I don't think the non-CDS route is going to be a viable route for those of you in America trying to go that way. So yes, that's what's that. And that's the end of my very brief talk. I hope that was on time. And I can see that there's questions in the chat. Should we go through some of the questions then?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks very much. Thank you very much indeed for such a practical tour of a very complicated issue. Yeah. So I'll pick through some. I think some came up at least partially through what you were saying. So I'll just take us through the list, and I'm sure some will be added as we go along. But first, we've got a question from Addy about any insights or guesses you might have about the kind of company we might expect to be one of the manufacturers to produce the first LLM-enabled medical device. If we should be, you mentioned that this is not a small task, you know, we're going to need an experienced and well-resourced team. Is it something that we would expect to come from a kind of smaller spin-out new company, or will it be a more established medtech firm or pharma company? Any thoughts at all on that?
I mean, it's very hard to say, but all we can look as historic precedent. If we look at all cutting-edge AI devices, which are now medical devices, they've all come from startups. So the first radiology AI devices came from startups. The first cardiology AI devices came from startups. So it could be a startup. The difference here is that actually startups can't create their own large language model. They haven't got $1 billion to train one. So it might actually be one of the bigger large language model companies. So I don't know is the answer. Who do I think it will be? Probably a startup or a small mid-sized company.
Yeah. And just a note, I can see a hand raised. If I could just ask you to add any questions you have to the Q&A. Sorry, the format doesn't allow us to dip in for people to ask their own questions. Next, could I just ask, you mentioned about the problem of varied inputs and outputs. Can you think of what the kind of practical implications of that are for clinical investigation design? And another question came in as well saying, is there a role for prompt engineering or some kind of standardization of how prompts are put into the LLM to manage that problem?
It's a totally unknown quantity at the moment. And you know, there have been some quite good papers out trying to find metrics that we can use to assess the consistency, accuracy, robustness, empathy, clarity of reports, of summarizations or outputs from a large language model. And this is where we have to rely heavily on research science and look at peer-reviewed literature and figure out, well, what are the metrics that are making the most sense? Like I said earlier, the auditors don't really know because they haven't audited this stuff yet. The typical thing that you do when you bring a medical device to market is you do a literature review to identify what are the thresholds and you know metrics that you should be hitting in terms of performance for your specific use case. And so it's going to vary depending on what the large language model is being used for. In terms of the non-determinism, that's very difficult. I can't think of any other thing in medicine that's used as a medical device that is non-deterministic. Humans are non-deterministic. You can ask 2 doctors an opinion, you'll get a different answer. but we are covered by our own regulated clinical practice. It's the first time ever that we've had potentially a machine medical device being non-deterministic. If you think about it, if you had a blood testing machine that just sort of gave you different numbers for the same blood sample, you wouldn't trust it. You wouldn't buy it. And these large language models do exactly that, and we get to see what those risks might be. So I don't know the answer to that. And then the second part was, can we control this through prompting? I mean, I gather you can to an extent, but again, you would have to show evidence that you are controlling it well enough through prompting. And then the counter to that is, can someone break your system by adversarially prompting your system? And that's almost impossible to control for if you allow free text input into the LLM. There's, you know, someone told me the other day that if we have an ambient scribe that is using a large language model as its back end, clever patients might start talking adversarial prompts to try and get the machine to spit out gobbledygook. It could happen. You just don't know.
Yeah.
And that's almost impossible to mitigate against.
Yeah.
But everything we do in medicine does come with risks. You know, we do surgery, there's a risk. You give a drug, there's a risk. The whole point of medical devices is not to have zero risk. It's to mitigate risk to the best extent possible or practical. No. Well, I think the definition is in the medical device regulations, to the best extent possible, regardless of financial cost. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you. I'm going to move on to a more kind of technical regulatory question here. So we might need a bit of help as well, just kind of setting the context of some of the documents mentioned. But what do you think about the MHRA stating they will be implementing the full IMDRF risk classification model rather than the amended version the EU used through the MDCG 2019-11? I'll leave you with that part first.
Yeah, so basically, so to those who aren't in the know, the European medical device regulation uses MDCG, which is Medical Device Council guidance, and they use that. That was published in 2019. The IMDRF have since updated their risk classification model, and because we've in Brexit, we don't follow EU, we can change to whatever we want. But the EU will probably take up the IMDRF one eventually anyway. Regulations shift and change all the time, which is why I'm not a big fan of automated regulatory software, because it can't keep up with all the changes. So yeah, I think it's great. It doesn't really mean that much. LLMs are still going to be class 2A and above, even under both risk classification tables. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think it goes into the second part of it as well. So I've got another question focusing on the software of unknown provenance issue you mentioned. Just asking if would you agree if GPT-4 and Gemini and LLMs like that are essentially just an API or black box, which are therefore software of unknown provenance, therefore cannot be used as a medical device? Does that hold from your perspective? And then the next part is Llama 2 and Mixtral are open source. There's some documentation on how it's trained, and therefore it's kind of known provenance, and so we could use them to train our own models.
So the provenance issue has a couple of aspects. First of all is you need to know what data it was trained on, to the level where copyright holders can uphold their rights under EU law. The second part is around GDPR and HIPAA. You need to know if there's data included in that training data that has specific identifiable components for individuals, whether they're the subject of the medical device or not. So you need to know what the training data held. And then the third part is the quality documentation that comes with that. And I've seen the Mistral documentation, but not others. It wouldn't pass regulatory audit. It's very light. It's not gone through proper risk management and quality management documentation processes. So currently, as far as I'm aware, that neither open or closed source large language models have the level of documentation required to allow them to be used as software of known provenance yet. This problem is solvable. We just need, companies like OpenAI or Mistral just need to actually provide that documentation if they want to see their models being the back end of medical devices.
And then we've got another question. Thank you, the participant that put their hand up, adding it to the chat. It may be a difficult thing to have insight into, but do you have much of a sense of how much training the teams within approved bodies have had in AI-specific medical devices or LLM medical devices for that matter?
I don't have insight into their internal training, but I do know that they're not ready to audit this kind of stuff yet. I mean, any software engineer who's working on large language models is going to be working either at a bigger company or their own startup. They're not going to be working for a regulatory body yet. That said, regulatory bodies are quite forward thinking, and they do often do roundtables, consensuses, and training days with the relevant people on the technologies that they're looking at. I think they will learn through practice. The first one will be the most difficult one because everyone's learning, and they will get better at it over time. But it is their job, and they're very used to auditing new technologies, so I'm sure they can adapt to this.
Great, thanks. We've got one from Alistair here saying, thank you very much, Hugh. You've emphasized what the regulations currently allow, but how do you respond to the challenge that this is a potentially useful tech that we need to adjust the regulations to accommodate?
I always counter potentially useful tech with potentially risky tech. And I think unless you can show that you mitigated all the risks, then it ceases to be useful. That's always my position on these kind of things. It's two sides to a coin. Yes, potentially useful, just like ChatGPT is potentially useful, though it comes with its own risks. And I think you've got to remember at the core of all this is patient safety. And you have to be satisfied as an end user that this is entirely safe to be handling patient data with. And in some cases, making decisions about those patients. And I think with great claims comes the requirement for great evidence. I'm sure no one would disagree with that.
Yeah. Okay, next we've got a question from Bart David. When a physician employs an open source language model for personal internal research, fine-tuning it with their data, does this qualify as research exempt from regulation?
If you're only using it for research purposes, that's absolutely fine. If you are using it on live clinical patients and putting the output of that large language model into the record so that other doctors may read it and rely on it, then it's potentially a medical device and it's being used on market unregulated, therefore illegally. So it will depend on what the exact intended use is. If it's just for research, so let's say, you're trying to do a paper on the number of patients who came to your fracture clinic last Thursday, and you use a large language model to summarize their notes for the research paper, that's absolutely fine because it's research.
What about the use? Thanks. I've got a question next from Kathleen Goldsmith. Do you think that the EU AI Act might be updated to allow for use of closed source LLMs like GPT, as it's likely unrealistic to expect each individual company to train their own LLMs?
I would say that's very unlikely. The EU AI Act took over 3 years and it's only just been passed a couple of weeks ago or last week. So any changes to it are going to be a long time coming. So I would say that's quite unlikely.
Thank you. And the next question asks you to reach for your crystal ball, I'm afraid. Do you think in the next 3 years within the EU we'll see an LLM-enabled medical device approved for use, for medical use?
Yes, I'm working on it right now.
And not necessarily related to that comment, I didn't intend it to pin you in that way, but I just wondered what kind of use cases you see as the pack leaders, as in the ones that are most viable commercially, clinically, from a regulatory perspective. What kind of spaces do you expect to see emerging tools
I think
come from?
the vast majority are summarizing in some form or another, either taking notes and summarizing them or reading a whole bunch of data and summarizing it. Humans are lazy. We don't want to do the reading. We just want to know the gist. And LLMs are fairly good at that. But to be used as a medical device, like I said, we need to make sure that they are safe and effective and they are quality assured. So yeah, I can't really go into too many commercial details, but yeah, that's the number one thing I think. There are, as I said, many other use cases, but I think transcription and summarization is by far the most popular right now.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what emerges. Again, taking a more kind of technical steer here, related to standards, would you recommend the use of the new British standard 34971? I presume that's meant specifically for LLMs, but maybe more generally as well.
Only if you're going for a UKCA mark, because it's a British standard. If you go for European or American, it's not a harmonized standard with their legislation. So, no.
I've got a question next from Gil Rebbe. Your assessment of non-computer decision support CDS with FDA makes sense for summarization of clinical notes because the model determines what it leaves out. But what about summarization of the consultation, in which it is not the model that determines what to leave out, but the physician themselves, both in the consultation and in the fact that they would review and approve the consultation summary before it is approved?
Yeah. So 2 points. Number one, it does not matter if a physician is reviewing the summary and approving afterwards. It's still a medical device. And number two, yes, you're right. The clinician is deciding during the flow of a clinical consultation what to ask and what not to ask, but they are regulated as a medical professional. So I would say that if the large language model is literally just transcribing and writing down everything that was said, then you don't need a large language model. You just need some kind of voice dictation software. If the large language model is summarizing, then it is deciding. I know that's the wrong word. It's not technically deciding, it's just summarizing as best as it can predict, but it is analyzing that data and outputting a summary, which by definition means it will leave out information. And the omission of information is a processing step that needs to be proven to be safe. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you very much. Next up, I've got a question from Divyam Tripathi. If the documentation of the AI large language model medical device documents its risks appropriately, like say it states that it's at a 40% hit rate, it's being open about its claims, can that allow a medical device to be regulated?
Absolutely. And here's the secret about medical device regulation. You get regulatory approved for the claim that you are trying to make. You could, if you wanted to waste your time and money, make a medical device that works 1% of the time, as long as your claim was it only works 1% of the time. So yes, you can do that.
Thank you very much. Next up, a question from Leon. That wasn't consultancy advice.
No, I'm being cheeky. I'm being cheeky. No, to answer it properly, technically, you have to prove that you meet state of the art. So what is state of the art? It's relatively vaguely designed in the medical device regulations, but essentially it's what is current used in common practice in the healthcare system. So current state of the art in terms of writing a referral letter is a doctor reads all the notes and writes a referral letter based on what they've read in the notes. So you have to compare to the state of the art. State of the art does not mean cutting edge. It doesn't mean what's available in the published research literature. It means what's practically used in healthcare today. So you have to compare against that.
Thanks very much. Next, we've got a question from Leon Dorn. Recently, I've seen feedback on the AI Act on LinkedIn, claiming that the AI Act would only apply very minimally to medical devices, e.g. that CE marking under the MDR would be sufficient to claim compliance against the AI Act. I doubt this, but have you heard similar information?
I have heard, and I agree that they're wrong. I think the EU AI Act is going to be very impactful on medical devices. They have to install some of the processes from 42001, which is the AI quality management standard. The post-market surveillance is increasingly beefed up, and there's increased processes around transparency and things like that. So yeah, it's incorrect to say it's minimal. It's not this. If you have a CE marked AI device, then it's some work to comply with the AI Act. It's not a huge amount of work, but it's not minimal either.
Thanks. We've just got a few more minutes left, so we'll have a couple more questions. And the next one's from Felix Spool. How could LLMs be used as interfaces to medical devices rather than being a soup component integral to the product? I.e., could a facade structure where the bridge code performs a risk-based input assessment be used instead of having full soup quality documentation?
So that's a very clever idea to try and get around it. But if you are analyzing the output of a medical device, you are analyzing medical signal patterns or data. So you are then a medical device, and then you assume the risk classification of the medical device of which you are ingesting that data. So for instance, if you have an app that is taking data from a wearable ECG monitor and then processing that data, that app is the same risk class as the ECG device itself. And that's the basic rule of thumb in medical device regulation. So it might well get around the soup component, but you're still a regulated medical device.
Thank you very much. Next, we got a question from Marta Pinto about the exponential hallucination problem you mentioned. Are you certain that LLMs, when summarizing multiple reports, would only add errors? Could it get to a point where it understands the context and even correct the errors?
Sure, show me the evidence it can do that. All I've seen so far, every time I've used ChatGPT, there's a small percentage of errors. And these errors can be super subtle that you don't even notice unless you're really trying to look. LLMs, by their nature, try and predict through tokenization the next word, the next most likely word. What that actually ends up meaning is that the text that is outputted is more generic than specific because it's trying to predict the next most likely word. Now, in medicine, that's where the risk lies because each patient is completely individual and their treatment pathway can be very different to other people in that same situation. So there's the errors could be those of regressing to a mean of standardized text or standardized outputs, when there actually might be nuance to that patient's clinical care that needed to be recorded. But the LLM has decided that actually the next most likely word or phrases is the one that regresses to the mean for that patient in that demographic. So yeah, I think there's still a risk there, which I'm not sure, A, how to quantify, or B, how to mitigate.
And then final question from Sergey Polovikov. Is there anything in the current or forthcoming regulatory framework that specifically addresses the interpretability and explainability of AI models for healthcare or otherwise?
I mean, there are standards around usability. So that's how users can interpret interacting with a device. So I would look to 6366 parts 1 and 2. I think the AI standard for memory does have some other bits on risk management, and then inherently within that is explainability. But there's certainly nothing around explainability for large language models published yet as a standard. So again, regulations shift and change. You've got to remember, we are at the cutting edge. We're surfing a wave and we're holding on for dear life. And the regulators are on the wave behind us. So a lot of what we're talking about is theoretical and untested. But I would imagine more regulation will come. And there's a famous saying, regulations are written in blood. And what that means is we really only write serious regulation after the fact that someone's come to harm. And I hope that doesn't become the case. There was one more question in there where someone didn't understand my exponential hallucination problem, saying, well, don't doctors also make errors and they could read other doctors' errors and replicate them? That's entirely true. Of course it is. But doctors can also correct errors and go, hang on, that's not right. And I don't think large language models have the capacity to do that. So I would say it's more risky with large language models. The other thing that doctors can't do is read 100 patient notes, 100 pages of patient notes and summarize it in 30 seconds. And therefore, it's going to be almost impossible for anyone who's reviewing the output to check that the large language model actually got that correct, because they won't have read the 100 pages of notes that the large language model just summarized. So the errors they'll be insidious, they'll be nuanced, they'll be vague, but they will add up and they'll grow exponentially over time, is my worry. It's a theoretical thing. It hasn't happened yet, but that's my concern. And I'm sure the regulators may share similar concerns.
Great. Well, thanks for picking that out. And thank you very much for taking us through such a complex topic so smoothly. I think the 30 questions in the Q&A can show you that it's well received.
No,
A
it's
brilliant
always
start to the series.
happy to talk on this. As I said, it's an untested area. And if you're bringing a large language model to market, have a word. Just give us an email, because you want to do it right. At the least, write an intended use statement down and try and figure out where you sit in between the grey zone and the medical device zone. Try and think about, if you are a medical device, what risk class you are, and then have serious consideration into, do I want to go on this journey and go and get a CE mark? Because it's going to take you time and resource to do so. And then anyone who's listening to this webinar who is currently being sold large language models for transcription, summarization, whatever, ask these important questions for the sake of your patients. Has this thing been approved? Is it quality assured? Is it risk mitigated? Is it supposed to be regulated? I guarantee the people selling it to you will squirm, but that's your duty as a health professional, to protect your patients. So please do that.
Well, thanks once again. And I've only got a few little kind of bits of housekeeping and extra information to bring us to a close. But we've got a little QR code here that you can scan if you're watching, or follow the same kind of website and links that you used, regulatoryscience.ai, to register for this event, to join the community, receive the newsletters and updates of future webinars and events. One of which, to flag here, is a participatory research event relating to healthcare AI held at an AI Fringe event at the upcoming Alan Turing Institute conference. So that's on the 27th of March. Please find more details about that on the website. And also, just to flag the next one of these webinars, we're going to be joined by Hamza Hussein, who's the Senior Category Manager for Digital and IT at NHS Shared Business Services. And this is in response to some of the conversations that we had at our conference back in December about the role that procurement plays for AI implementation, and trying to understand what needs to be done to try and navigate that particular labyrinth in good time, or that gauntlet in good time. As I mentioned, we really want to hear from you the kind of issues that you want to hear us talk about and explore together. And we're going to have a more streamlined infrastructure for that set up before long. But for the time being, we've got an email account here for the incubator. Please do send any thoughts and messages that way. But we're bang on time, more or less, there. So nothing remains other than to say thank you very much, Hugh, for joining us and launching us into this webinar series. Thank you very much indeed to Jazz Gill, who's been making the operational side of this run smoothly. And thank you very much to all of you for signing in today and joining us for the talk. So we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.